The policeman stopped Chuck Norris, but had no idea that this seemingly ordinary moment would change everything. The officer's aggressive behavior quickly attracted the attention of passers-by, but what happened next was a real shock. Subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the quiet town as Chuck Norris drove through its empty streets. The town had that unmistakable small-town charm: old brick buildings, faded signs of family-run stores, and people strolling leisurely along the sidewalks, exchanging casual greetings. It was the kind of place where time seemed to slow down, where people still waved to passing cars, and where the air carried the scent of freshly baked bread from the local bakery. Chuck had spent the afternoon at a community center just outside town, hosting a self-defense seminar for at-risk youth. He had seen their eager eyes, their quiet desperation for guidance, and had taken his time not just demonstrating techniques but explaining the philosophy behind them. Strength, he had told them, was not in brute force but in control. Power lay in knowing when to act and when to walk away. They had listened intently, absorbing his words like parched earth drinking in rain. He had left the center with a sense of satisfaction, knowing that at least a few of those kids might carry his lessons with them. Now, as he navigated the streets, the hum of his truck's engine was accompanied by the soft blues playing through the radio. The road was mostly clear, a few parked cars lining the sidewalks, an occasional pedestrian crossing. He was in no rush. The trip was meant to be a quiet end to a productive day, a chance to enjoy the simplicity of the open road before heading back to his cabin outside the city. Approaching an intersection, Chuck instinctively eased off the gas, rolling to a stop at the marked sign. His eyes swept the surroundings. To his left, a man walked his dog past a hardware store. To his right, a woman carried a bag of groceries while a young child clung to her other hand. No other cars approached. After a brief pause, he pressed the accelerator and moved forward, passing through the intersection at a calm, measured speed. The instant he cleared the crossing, red and blue lights flashed in his rearview mirror. A sharp wail of a siren cut through the stillness, the sound abrupt and jarring against the otherwise peaceful setting. Chuck glanced at the mirror. A patrol car had pulled up behind him, closing the distance fast. His brows knitted slightly, not in worry but in mild surprise. He knew for certain that he had stopped at the intersection, followed every rule of the road. There was no reason for a traffic stop, but this wasn't a moment to question or challenge. It was a moment to follow procedure. With the same calm he carried in all things, he signaled right and pulled over, bringing his truck to a smooth stop at the curb. He shut off the engine and placed his hands on the steering wheel, waiting. There was no reason for concern, but something about the way the patrol car had sped up to him, the way the siren had blared aggressively in an otherwise empty street, made the air feel heavier. A door slammed shut behind him. He heard the heavy boots striking against the pavement, a rhythm that was too quick, too purposeful. There was a difference between an officer approaching with due diligence and one approaching with intent. This one, Chuck could tell, had the latter. In his side mirror, he caught sight of the officer stepping toward his truck. The man was large, broad-shouldered, his uniform neatly pressed but his posture rigid. His face was locked in a firm, almost hostile expression. The way he walked, the way his hand rested near his holster, radiated something that Chuck had seen many times before: aggression masked as authority. The officer stopped at the driver's side window, standing tall, his chin slightly lifted as he looked down. His presence demanded dominance, as if he had already made up his mind about the situation before it had even begun. Chuck kept his expression neutral. He had been in countless situations where a show of force had been an instinctive response to his presence. His reputation, his physicality, his very existence seemed to provoke a challenge in some men. Some people saw his face and felt the need to test themselves, to prove that they held the power in whatever interaction they were about to have. But this wasn't a fight. This was a traffic stop. And the last thing Chuck Norris ever needed to do was escalate something that could be resolved with patience. The officer exhaled sharply, then tapped on the glass, the sound short and sharp. Chuck rolled down the window, the cool evening air filtering in as he turned his head slightly to meet the man's gaze. Silence lingered just long enough to make the moment heavier. The air carried the faint scent of asphalt and exhaust, mingling with the distant aroma of fried food from a nearby diner. A few pedestrians had slowed their steps, noticing the flashing lights, sensing the tension in the atmosphere. Something about this wasn't right. Chuck had seen and experienced enough in his life to recognize when a situation was heading in the wrong direction. The question now was whether this officer had already decided what was going to happen, or whether there was still a chance to steer things toward reason. The officer stood rigidly beside the truck, his presence exuding an air of control that was too forced, too practiced. His uniform was crisp, the badge on his chest gleaming under the glow of the setting sun. His fingers twitched near his belt, hovering close to the holster, a silent declaration of authority. He did not introduce himself, did not offer the typical routine pleasantries that officers usually gave during a routine traffic stop. Instead, his stance, his expression, the sharp breath he took before speaking, it all signaled something different. "License and registration," the officer said, his voice flat but edged with something unspoken. Chuck moved with a calculated ease, making sure every motion was slow and deliberate. He had been in enough situations to know that certain people were just waiting for an excuse to escalate. Without breaking eye contact, he reached for the glove compartment, opened it smoothly, and pulled out the registration. Then he took his wallet from his pocket and retrieved his license, offering both documents with a steady hand. The officer snatched them quickly, barely glancing at them before turning his gaze back to Chuck. He studied him in silence, his eyes scanning the older man's face, the muscles in his jaw twitching slightly as if trying to process something. There was a flicker of recognition, but it was fleeting, buried beneath the hardened expression. "You ran a stop sign," the officer finally said, his tone accusatory rather than informative. Chuck did not immediately respond. He let the statement hang in the air, weighing the situation carefully. He knew, without a doubt, that he had stopped. Not just because it was second nature to him, but because he was always hyper-aware of his surroundings. This wasn't about a traffic violation. This was something else. "I'm sure I stopped," Chuck finally said, his voice calm, measured. The officer's eyes narrowed. The tension in his stance tightened. He took a half step closer to the truck, the movement slight but intentional. "Are you arguing with me?" he asked. Chuck held his gaze, his expression unreadable. This was a moment of choice. He could push back, demand answers, or simply let the conversation unfold. He chose the latter. "I'm just saying that I believe I stopped fully," he replied evenly. "But if you say otherwise, then I suppose that's up to you." The words were neutral, carefully chosen, but something in them must have struck a nerve. The officer exhaled sharply, then straightened. He looked past Chuck, scanning the truck as if searching for something, anything, that could justify whatever was brewing inside him. "Step out of the vehicle," he said. Chuck remained still. A small shift in the air passed between them, the kind that signaled an escalation before it even happened. He knew the pattern. Authority was being challenged even if it wasn't directly. And when someone like this officer felt that control slipping, they grabbed on to whatever they could to pull it back. "Any particular reason?" Chuck asked. "You match a description," the officer said, the words coming too quickly, too rehearsed. "Now, step out of the vehicle." There it was. An excuse, manufactured or not, to justify what was clearly an unnecessary level of force for a traffic stop. Chuck could feel it in his gut. He took a slow breath before moving. His body language remained relaxed, but his instincts were awake now, sharp and alert. He had spent years training his body and mind to recognize threats before they became unavoidable. And, right now, everything in him told him that this man wanted a confrontation. The officer stepped back, his grip shifting toward his holster as Chuck opened the door and stepped onto the pavement. He didn't resist. He didn't argue. He simply complied, not because he was afraid, but because he knew that any resistance, even verbal, would only be twisted into something worse. A few people had gathered nearby, pedestrians who had stopped in their tracks, drawn by the flashing lights and the sight of an escalating situation. Some of them held phones up recording the scene. A few murmured among themselves, recognizing who Chuck was, whispering his name under their breath. The officer, however, seemed unfazed by the attention. If anything, it made him more rigid, more determined to maintain the illusion of dominance. "Face the truck, hands on the hood," he ordered. Chuck turned slowly, placing his hands on the warm metal of the truck's hood. He could hear the murmur of the growing crowd behind him. The weight of their eyes was heavy. He knew exactly what they were seeing. A man being treated like a criminal for no discernible reason. The officer approached, his breath audible over the hum of the city settling into evening. The touch came next, rough, forceful. Hands pressing against Chuck's back, down his sides, over his arms. It wasn't a search for weapons, it was an assertion of control, a reminder of power. In the distance, someone shouted, "Hey, why are you treating him like that?" The officer ignored it. His hands moved to Chuck's pockets, checking them aggressively before stepping back. "What exactly are you looking for?" Chuck asked, his voice still even. "Whatever I find," the officer replied. The answer was telling. Chuck exhaled slowly. He had done nothing wrong. He knew it. The officer knew it. The people watching knew it. And yet, here they were, in a situation that only had one inevitable outcome. "Turn around," the officer commanded. Chuck did. He stood tall, his gaze locked onto the officer's with unwavering steadiness. And that was the moment something in the officer shifted. Maybe it was the way Chuck refused to be cowed, or the realization that cameras were capturing every second of this encounter. But his grip on his belt tightened, his expression hardened further, and something in his eyes flashed dangerously. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," the officer said. The words carried weight, finality. The situation had been decided. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Someone moved closer, angling their phone for a better shot. Another voice rose, demanding to know what the charge was. But the officer wasn't listening. His hand was already moving toward the cuffs, ready to make this moment official. Chuck stood still, aware of the point they had reached. The officer wanted submission. He wanted obedience. And most of all, he wanted control. Chuck had been in enough fights to know that sometimes the best strategy wasn't to strike back. It was to let the other person show their hand first. So he didn't resist. He didn't fight. He simply watched. because this, he knew, was far from over. Chuck stood still, his expression unreadable as the officer's fingers curled around the handcuffs. The murmurs from the crowd had grown into full voices now, some of them questioning, others angry. The flashing lights of the patrol car painted the street in alternating shades of red and blue, the glow reflecting off the lenses of the smartphones held aloft by onlookers. Chuck knew that everything happening in this moment was being recorded, dissected in real time. The entire situation had shifted from an unjustified traffic stop to something far more serious. The officer, however, seemed unmoved by the presence of witnesses. If anything, the growing crowd only made him more aggressive, as if their attention challenged his authority. He stepped closer, his jaw tight, his eyes filled with something dangerously close to hostility. Chuck had seen that look before. It wasn't about law enforcement, it wasn't about upholding justice. It was about power, about proving something, about making a statement. The metal of the cuffs clinked as the officer pulled them from his belt. The weight of them was a declaration. This wasn't just an arrest. This was meant to be a display. Chuck recognized it for what it was, a warning to everyone watching, an example of what happened when someone questioned the wrong man in the wrong uniform. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," the officer repeated, his voice sharper, louder. Chuck didn't move right away. Not in defiance, not in resistance, but because he understood exactly where this was headed. The officer had already decided the outcome of this moment long before he had stepped out of his patrol car. No words would change that now. The tension in the air was suffocating. The bystanders had gone silent, waiting, watching. Then it happened. The officer reached forward suddenly, grabbing Chuck's arm in an attempt to yank it behind his back. The movement was rough, unnecessarily forceful. Chuck barely had time to react before the second hand came up, shoving him forward. His palm hit the hood of his own truck, his body pressed against the metal as the officer leaned in. The force was excessive, meant to dominate rather than restrain. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. Someone yelled out, "Hey, what the hell is he doing?" Chuck clenched his jaw. He had dealt with men like this before, had seen how quickly control turned into violence when unchecked authority was left to its own devices. He could feel the officer's frustration, the way his grip tightened, the way he was bracing for a fight that Chuck had never offered. And that was the problem. The officer wanted resistance. He needed it. He needed Chuck to push back, to react, to give him justification for what he clearly already planned to do. But Chuck didn't give him that. Instead, he remained still, his body relaxed despite the pressure against his back. His breathing remained even, his mind calm. He had been in worse situations. He had faced real threats. This was nothing more than a man with a badge who had mistaken his uniform for a throne. The officer didn't like that. His grip on Chuck's wrist tightened painfully, twisting it at an unnatural angle. The pain was sharp, deliberate, a provocation. Chuck inhaled slowly, his muscles tensing against the instinct to react. "Let him go," a voice from the crowd shouted. "That's Chuck Norris," another yelled. "Are you insane?" The recognition rippled through the onlookers. Some had already known, but now, as the word spread, the energy of the scene shifted. People stepped closer, their phones recording every second. The officer hesitated for a fraction of a second, a flicker of something passing over his face. Maybe it was realization. Maybe it was doubt. But then, just as quickly, it was gone. If anything, the knowledge of who Chuck was only seemed to fuel his determination. He had gone too far now. Backing down would mean admitting fault, and men like this didn't admit fault. He yanked harder on Chuck's arm, attempting to pull it fully behind his back. Chuck allowed himself a fraction of movement, just enough to lessen the pressure without giving the officer the struggle he wanted. But the officer wasn't looking for cooperation. He was looking for control. With a grunt of frustration, he shoved Chuck harder, his full weight pressing down. The move was meant to be final, to force submission. But Chuck had spent a lifetime training his body to react on instinct, and the moment he felt the shift, he adjusted. It happened in the blink of an eye. Chuck pivoted slightly, just enough to break the officer's leverage without force, shifting his weight in a way that made it impossible for him to maintain control. The officer stumbled slightly, caught off guard, his frustration flashing into something darker. And then, in a move that solidified everything, the officer went for his baton. The crowd erupted in shouts as he unhooked it from his belt, his fingers wrapping tightly around the handle. He lifted it just enough to be a threat, just enough to make his intentions clear. The air in the street shifted. Chuck met the officer's gaze, seeing the moment he crossed the line from maintaining order to something else entirely. A second patrol car screeched to a halt nearby. The sound was loud, cutting through the escalating tension. Another officer stepped out, his face instantly registering confusion at the sight before him. He looked at Chuck, then at the officer gripping the baton, then at the crowd of people recording every second. The situation had reached a breaking point. "Stand down," the second officer barked. The first officer flinched at the command, his fingers still curled around the baton. He hesitated, his mind racing through his options. He had wanted to prove dominance, but now he was the one being watched, the one being judged. Slowly, reluctantly, he released the baton and took a step back. Chuck remained still. He didn't adjust his stance, didn't gloat, didn't react. He just watched. The second officer stepped closer, his eyes moving between Chuck and his colleague. "Are you all right, sir?" he asked. Chuck nodded once. The officer turned to his fellow cop, his voice sharp with controlled anger. "What the hell is going on here?" The first officer's face hardened, his jaw tightening, but he said nothing. The weight of the situation was finally catching up to him, the realization that whatever control he thought he had was slipping. The crowd didn't back down. Phones were still raised. Murmurs filled the street. Chuck exhaled slowly. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. But the moment had shifted. The officer had made a mistake. And now there was no hiding it. Chuck knew exactly where this was headed next. The footage spread like wildfire. By the time Chuck Norris left the scene that evening, videos of the incident had already begun circulating online, gathering thousands of views, then millions. The headlines varied, but they all carried the same undertone of disbelief. Chuck Norris detained in unjustified police stop. Officer uses excessive force on Chuck Norris caught on camera. Viral video sparks national debate on police conduct. The internet exploded with outrage. Supporters flooded social media with posts calling for accountability, tagging police reform activists, legal experts, and even politicians. Celebrities and public figures weighed in, some expressing shock that a man as universally recognized and respected as Chuck Norris could be subjected to such treatment. Others pointed out what was obvious, that if this could happen to someone as famous as Chuck, it could happen to anyone. Interviews aired on primetime news with legal analysts breaking down the footage frame by frame. The slow-motion replay of the officer grabbing Chuck, the tightening grip, the attempt to force him into submission, and the moment the baton was drawn were dissected by experts across the country. Discussions on racial profiling, abuse of power, and the consequences of unchecked authority flooded news segments. Even those who typically defended law enforcement found themselves at a loss for words. The facts were clear. The police department of the small town, overwhelmed by the sudden and unrelenting scrutiny, released a statement within 24 hours. They announced an internal investigation, stating that the actions of Officer Mark Darriot were under review. But the wording of the statement was careful, crafted to appease both sides while saying very little of substance. Chuck, meanwhile, remained silent. He had received calls from journalists, television networks, and even political figures looking for a statement, but he declined them all. He knew better than anyone that words in the heat of the moment could do more harm than good. He wasn't interested in fueling outrage. He was interested in change. The real breaking point came when a local journalist began digging into Officer Darriot's record. What she found was disturbing. Over the past 7 years, Darriot had been the subject of multiple complaints, allegations of excessive force, racial profiling, and unwarranted aggression. Most of the cases had quietly disappeared, buried under administrative excuses or internal reviews that led to nothing. Her article, A Pattern of Power, The Troubling Record of Officer Darriot, was published within days of the incident. It detailed each complaint, each dismissed case, each instance where Darriot had walked away without consequence. The article exposed a system that had repeatedly chosen to protect the officer rather than the community he was sworn to serve. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Protests began outside the town's police station. What started as a small gathering of concerned citizens quickly grew into something larger. People traveled from neighboring cities to join, bringing signs that read, "Justice for all," and "No more abuse." The chants of the crowd echoed through the streets, their voices demanding accountability, demanding reform. Local leaders attempted damage control. The police chief held a press conference, stiff-faced and visibly uncomfortable, as he addressed the growing unrest. He assured the public that the department took the incident seriously and that Officer Darriot had been placed on administrative leave pending the investigation. But that wasn't enough. The people weren't asking for a temporary suspension. They were asking for justice. Meanwhile, Chuck met with his team. His longtime friend and business associate, who had been managing his public engagements for years, was the first to speak. "You need to say something, Chuck. The world is watching." He knew she was right. Remaining silent for too long would allow others to shape the narrative, and that wasn't an option. But if he was going to speak, it had to be with purpose. He had no interest in making this about himself. This wasn't just his story. This was bigger than one bad cop or one violent encounter. Finally, Chuck's team released a brief but powerful statement. It didn't attack the officer. It didn't call for vengeance. It simply called for accountability, for an honest conversation about what had happened, not just to him, but to countless others who didn't have cameras, who didn't have millions of people rallying behind them. It was a call to action, a demand for meaningful change. The response was staggering. Donations poured into organizations advocating for police reform. Activists used the momentum to push for policy changes, demanding new regulations on use of force protocols and independent oversight committees. Community meetings were organized, town halls scheduled, but the most unexpected shift came from within the police department itself. Officers, both current and former, began speaking out, some anonymously, others publicly. A few admitted they had witnessed Officer Dario's behavior before, but had felt powerless to intervene. Others acknowledged that this wasn't an isolated issue, that the culture within law enforcement needed to change. Dario, meanwhile, remained silent. His lawyers advised him not to make any public statements, and his colleagues quickly distanced themselves from him. The department that had protected him for years was now looking for a way to contain the fallout. Then, the moment that sealed everything came. An official investigation into not just Dario, but the entire department's handling of complaints against officers. The state attorney general announced that a formal review would be conducted, focusing on the department's disciplinary record, its internal review process, and its handling of excessive force cases. It was no longer just about one officer. It was about a system that had allowed him to thrive unchecked. For Chuck, the shift was exactly what he had hoped for. The conversation was no longer about him. It was about the bigger picture. The protests continued, but they evolved. They became more than just a demand for Dario's firing. They became a demand for systemic change. Local activists, led by a determined woman named Maya Torres, organized community meetings where residents and police officers were invited to sit down together, to listen to each other, to talk about what needed to be done. Chuck watched as the movement grew beyond him, beyond the incident. It was no longer about a single moment caught on camera. It was about the people who had never been caught on camera, the stories that had been ignored, the voices that had gone unheard. The question now wasn't whether change was needed. That had already been made clear. The question was, what would they do next? The protests had not stopped, but their tone had shifted. What had begun as outrage had transformed into something more organized, more focused. The chants demanding justice had evolved into structured discussions, calls for policy changes, and demands for action from local government officials. What had once been a town where a police officer could act without fear of consequences was now a place where people were no longer willing to be silent. The pressure mounted daily, and the police department found itself unable to ignore the weight of public scrutiny. Chuck had been watching everything unfold with quiet resolve. He had spent his life as a fighter, but this was not a fight that could be won with fists or force. It was a battle of principles, of awareness, of shifting perspectives. His role was not to throw fuel on the fire, but to use the attention on the incident to push the conversation forward. He wasn't interested in destroying a man's career. He was interested in ensuring that what had happened to him wouldn't happen to anyone else. Then came the announcement. The police department, under mounting pressure, formally terminated Officer Dario's employment. The decision was swift, a clear attempt at damage control, but for many it wasn't enough. Firing one officer did not erase the history of complaints that had been buried, nor did it fix the system that had allowed him to remain on the force for so long. The community wanted more than just a symbolic gesture. They wanted real reform. Chuck sat in on one of the community meetings, listening as activists, legal experts, and even former law enforcement officers spoke about the next steps. A panel had been formed to oversee changes within the department, including independent oversight for misconduct cases and mandatory de-escalation training for all officers. It was a start, but Chuck knew that change wasn't just about policy, it was about culture, about the mindset within law enforcement, about the way officers saw the people they were supposed to protect. He met with Maya Torres, the local activist who had been leading much of the movement. She was young but sharp, unrelenting in her pursuit of justice. She had a way of speaking that made people listen, not just because she was passionate, but because she knew exactly what she was fighting for. She didn't just want a temporary fix, she wanted systemic change. Chuck admired that. Together, they worked on a plan that extended beyond just this one town. They launched an initiative focused on reforming police training programs, emphasizing the importance of de-escalation techniques, implicit bias training, and community engagement. Chuck used his influence to secure funding, reaching out to his network, pulling in resources that could turn this movement into something real, something lasting. But the changes weren't just happening in the community. Within the police department itself, a shift was taking place. Officers who had once remained silent about misconduct were now speaking up. Some admitted that they had turned a blind eye for too long. Others expressed their own frustrations with the system, with the pressure to always assert dominance rather than build trust. The walls of secrecy that had protected officers like Dariote for years were beginning to crack. Chuck saw the change firsthand when he attended one of the first de-escalation training sessions mandated for the department. The room was filled with officers who had spent their entire careers being told that authority was the only way to maintain control. Now they were being taught something different. They were being asked to listen, to understand, to see the people they served not as threats, but as human beings. It was uncomfortable for some, but necessary for all. Then came something unexpected. Mark Dariote, the disgraced officer, reached out. He had avoided the public eye since his firing, retreating into isolation as the weight of his actions and their consequences bore down on him. But now he wanted to talk. Chuck agreed to meet him, not out of sympathy, but out of curiosity. He wanted to see if the man who had once stood over him with a baton in hand had truly come to terms with what he had done. They met in a quiet, neutral place. No cameras, no audience, just two men sitting across from each other. Dariote looked different. The arrogance, the rigid confidence that had once defined him, was gone. In its place was something else. Shame, perhaps, or realization. He admitted that he had been wrong, that he had let his own prejudices dictate his actions. He didn't make excuses. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He simply acknowledged the truth. Chuck listened, saying little, letting the man speak. When Dariote finally asked what he was supposed to do now, Chuck gave him the only answer that mattered: change. Not for public approval, not for redemption in the eyes of the world, but because it was the right thing to do. Dariote left that meeting with no promises, no absolution. Whether he would truly change or not was something only time would reveal. But Chuck knew one thing: acknowledging the problem was the first step. What came next was a choice. Months passed, and the town began to settle into its new reality. The protests became community projects. The outrage transformed into action. The police department, once a source of unchecked authority, was now under constant accountability. It wasn't perfect. It wouldn't be for a long time. But it was better. Chuck returned to the community center where he had originally taught the self-defense seminar. This time, not just as a martial artist, but as a part of something bigger. He watched as young people, once uncertain about their place in the world, now stood taller, more confident. He saw police officers attending training sessions, not because they were forced to, but because they wanted to learn. He saw a town that had been fractured begin to rebuild, not through fear, but through understanding. One evening, he sat outside, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. A group of kids from the seminar ran past, laughing, full of energy and life. One of them stopped and looked up at him with wide eyes. "Mr. Norris," the boy said, "are you going to teach us more cool moves tomorrow?" Chuck smiled, nodding. "Yeah, kid, tomorrow." Because the fight for justice wasn't won in a day. But, step by step, moment by moment, it moved forward, and that was a battle worth fighting. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Check out other videos on the channel for more, and share this one with others who might find it interesting.